All right, well, welcome to the last class of Genesis, finally. I feel kind of bad because we're kind of having to rush through the last 17 chapters or so. But the scope of this class was more to focus on the beginning 11 or 12 chapters, as that really sets the foundation for our faith and for what we believe in. So while certainly there is much to learn from the patriarchs, as we've been calling them, certainly I think we spend a lot of good time in those first 12 chapters kind of laying the foundation for our faith, seeing the first, seeing where we came from, seeing the creation of the universe, seeing how special mankind is, seeing where sin came from, the first mention of salvation, seeing how man's sin was responsible for the world that we live in today, for the brokenness that was there, for seeing where all the languages came from, for seeing the origin of the doctrine of marriage, for seeing the idea of capital punishment, and just understanding how valuable and precious mankind's life is. All of those things we've been able to see here in the book of Genesis. And over the last few lessons, we've been looking at the origin of the nation of Israel. And we're going to finish today by talking about Israel himself, or as we more commonly know him as Jacob, and his family, who would eventually become the 12 tribes. So for today, my primary focus is going to be on the people as we look at these. We'll touch on some of the events, but really all the events that happened between Genesis chapter 32 and Genesis chapter 50 focus primarily on the people. And there are some things that unfortunately we're going to have to kind of gloss over, and I wish we didn't, but due to the amount of time that we are stuck with, we won't be able to. But I encourage you to study some of those things that maybe we don't have time to go over, especially Genesis 49. We won't have much time to go into Genesis 49 today, but I would encourage you to read through it on your own. See the different things that Jacob had to say to his family right before his death. Spoiler alert, Jacob dies. It's not really a spoiler, all mankind dies, but certainly we'll take a brief look at that. So we're going to start looking at the life of Jacob. In the previous lesson we talked about Isaac, his father. And so as we look at Jacob, we understand, we talked briefly last time about how he tricked his way into receiving the birthright and the blessing. Now, we didn't talk about this too much with Isaac, just simply because it does focus more on Jacob. But if you look, if you recall, when Jacob is born, shortly after he's born, in Genesis chapter 25, the two of them grow up, and as they're growing up, Esau becomes a hunter, and Jacob spends his time at home. Probably either working around the tent, as they didn't have a solid home, either working around the tent or perhaps tending to the animals. And Esau, as he goes out, he becomes hungry, comes back probably with nothing, and sees Jacob there cooking. And essentially in Genesis 25 he says, give me some of your pottage, that's what the Bible calls it, or stew, so that I can eat. He's very, very hungry. It says, for I am faint. And Jacob, being the cunning brother that he was, as his name implies, Jacob does essentially mean usurper or trickster. He says, sell me this day thy birthright. Now, I'm from a family of two. There was me and my brother. Certainly there were times where I wanted something from my brother, and he, realizing he could get something from me for this, would try to sell me whatever it was that I wanted. Now, I never sold my birthright or anything. We don't kind of have that. But back in the day, the idea of the birthright was the oldest son was entitled to a double portion of the inheritance. We here in America don't really think of it all that much because, well, at least for most of the families that I've talked to, the inheritance is usually equally divided amongst the inheritance. All of the goods when someone dies is usually equally divided amongst all the children. At least that's how it is in my family. That's how it is in some of the other families that I've talked to this about. Basically, they just divide the idea is upon death, in the will, it's written that all of the money, whatever's left over after all the expenses, is to be divided equally amongst the children. Well, back in this time, that wasn't true. In this time, if you were the firstborn, you received a double portion of the inheritance. So in this case, if we're going with a family of two, Esau was to receive 2/3 of all of Jacob's goods, or Isaac's goods, excuse me, and Jacob would only receive 1/3 of the goods. And so Jacob decides to take some matters into his own hands and basically tells Esau to sell him his birthright. Esau does, probably without thinking. He was probably just thinking it's just some words, it doesn't really matter. The Bible says that he despised his birthright. It didn't mean anything to him, probably because he expected Isaac to live a good long time, and Jacob would probably forget by the time Isaac died that he had taken the birthright. But nonetheless, Esau gives up 1/3 of his inheritance over for a bowl of soup, and despises his birthright that way. Now, the sad part about this, at least on Jacob's end, okay, Jacob is taking matters into his own hands. If you remember last time when we talked about the birth of Jacob and Esau, God had told Rebekah that the older would serve the younger, that God had always intended for Jacob to be the primary person through which God would carry on the Abrahamic covenant. Jacob did not need to do anything at all. He did not need to take this into his hands. God had promised that this would happen. But Jacob takes things into his own hands, and we're going to see that's going to cause a little bit of problem in Genesis chapter 27. In Genesis 27, Isaac thinks he's going to die. Now, he's not. Isaac actually lives for quite a bit longer after the story of Genesis 27. But he gets old, he starts going blind, and he starts to panic. And he thinks, I'm going to die. It says, I am old, I know not the day of my death. He thinks it's coming very soon in Genesis 27:2. So he tells Esau, go, take thy weapons, thy quiver, and thy bow. Go out and take me some venison, and make me some savory meat such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, that my soul may bless thee before I die. It was customary at this point, during this time, that before someone would die, he would give a blessing to his children. He would pass down some kind of blessing. We'll see that again later in Genesis 49. And so Isaac here thinks he's on death's door. So he says, I need to bless my children before I die. And so he tells Esau, go out and get me some food so I can bless you. Well, Jacob and Rebekah hear about it. And so they decide to take matters into their own hands, especially Rebekah. She comes back and speaks unto Jacob her son, verse 6. Behold, I heard thy father speak unto Esau thy brother, saying, bring me venison, and make me savory meat, that I may eat and bless thee before the Lord before my death. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice, according to that which I command thee. Go now to the flock, and fetch me from thence 2 good kids of the goats. Thou make them savory meat for thy father, such as he loveth. And thou shalt bring it to thy father, that he may eat, and that he may bless thee before his death. Now I encourage you to read through kind of the rest of this on your own, because there's a lot that goes on here. But Rebekah and Jacob construct this elaborate plot to trick Isaac. He's going blind. They didn't have optometrists back then. It's not like he could go and get cataract surgery or get special glasses or anything like that. He was going blind. He could not see very well, and so Rebekah and Jacob bank on the fact that he can't see, but that he's able to feel and smell. Apparently he was hard of hearing too. I say that because it doesn't say anywhere that Jacob tries to disguise his voice or anything. And me and my brother, we have very different voices. Perhaps, but he thinks that he's going to. He thinks he hears Jacob in verse 22. It says the voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. So I guess they bank on the fact that he's an old man and thinks that his hearing is troubled. If he had trusted his hearing, he would have been able to figure out the plan. But Jacob goes through with it, and he receives the blessing, at which point Esau comes back. Verse 31, he also made savory meat and brought it unto his father, and said unto his father, Let my father arise, and eat of his son's venison, that thy soul may bless me. And Isaac his father said unto him, Who art thou? And he said, I am thy son, thy firstborn, Esau. And Isaac trembled very exceedingly, and said, Who? Where is he that hath taken venison and brought it me? And I have eaten of all before thou camest, and have blessed him. Yea, and he shall be blessed. When Esau heard the words of his father, he cried with a great and exceeding bitter cry, and said unto his father, Bless me, even me also, O my father. And so Isaac is able to give him a smaller blessing, but it is not the same level of blessing. The idea of nations bowing before him and passing on the Abrahamic blessing covenant. If you look at the very end of verse 29, Isaac tells Jacob, Cursed be everyone that curseth thee, and blessed be everyone that blesseth thee. Kind of the idea of passing on that covenant. Now, it wasn't the full passing. We'll see that a little bit later. But this causes a rift, understandably, between Esau and Jacob. Jacob, through deceit, through trickery, has essentially gotten what belonged to Esau. Now, again, Jacob shouldn't have worried. God had promised that the elder would serve the younger, that Esau would be underneath Jacob. Now it seems that Isaac either was not told, after all in the account of Genesis 25, God tells Rebekah this. Either Isaac was not told, or else Isaac was told and chose to ignore what God had said, choosing to favor Esau instead of Jacob. Whatever it might be, this causes a rift, and the two of them, or rather Jacob, ends up fleeing for his life to his uncle Laban, who we've seen before. Laban was Rebekah's brother, and so Isaac, wanting to make sure that Jacob was safe from Esau's wrath, Rebekah, Isaac and Rebekah, Isaac wanting Jacob to find a wife in a manner similar to how he himself received Rebekah as a wife, tells him to go to Laban to take a wife from there, so that he would not be taking a wife from the Canaanites. Because again, the idea was it was better to marry a woman who followed the same religious practices as you, because as you can see reading throughout the Bible, whenever there is a mixing of religions, it is almost always the one that does not follow Jehovah that ends up being the one to kind of take control of the religious practices. With all the Baal worship and things, I think the people who readily come to mind are Solomon and Ahab. Solomon with his 300 wives and starting to go after their gods, and then Ahab with the Baal worship because he married Jezebel. And so the idea here is, if Jacob marries someone who is from the family, even a distant relative, at least that person is more than likely going to be serving Jehovah, and so thus they will not lead Jacob astray. So he ends up going to Laban and works 14 years for 2 wives. It's at this point the trickster is himself tricked. He did not count that his uncle would fool him. To kind of just give a brief summarization of the story for sake of time, Jacob goes to Padan Aram to meet Laban, and there he sees Rachel, yes, for some reason my mind started thinking Rebecca. Rachel. He saw Rachel and fell in love with Rachel. The problem was Rachel was younger of another daughter, Leah. And so, not wanting to, I guess, short Leah of what was due to her, Laban tells Jacob to work for 7 years for Rachel. At the end of 7 years, they get married, and when Jacob removes the bridal veil, behold, it is not Rachel, it is Leah. Now the Bible calls her tender-eyed. I have no idea what that means. I've heard several preachers say either she was tender on the eyes, that she was not a good-looking person to look at. I've heard some preachers say that perhaps she had something wrong with her eyes. I looked at the words myself. I can't really determine one way or the other. The idea is, though, there's something not desirable about Leah. And so some commentators and some people that I've listened to talk about how it seems, well, not commentators, but some people that have read the story say, well, how could he not have known? How could he have been standing there next to this woman and not known that it was Leah that was under the veil and not Rachel? Well, that's where we have to that's where we have to talk about cultural differences. Here in the Western world, when we have a wedding, the woman wears a veil, but it's usually rather transparent. It's kind of easy to see through. It's not, it's not completely clear or anything, but it does obscure the face a little bit, but it doesn't hide the face completely. You could still see who's underneath. Well, in Eastern cultures, the veil completely obstructs all view of the person underneath it. In fact, in some cultures, specifically I believe in Indian culture, not only is there a veil over the bride's face, the bride and the groom have a blanket separating them during most of the ceremony. And they're just holding hands between the blanket. They cannot see each other at all. And so it would not surprise me if something similar was going on, to where Leah was completely obstructed from Jacob's view until after the ceremony was over and it was all said and done. And then when he removed the veil, behold, it's not the woman that he wanted to marry. So he goes to Laban, upset, and asks why he was tricked. And Laban basically gives some half-baked excuse about how the younger should not be married before the older. And I'm sure that there are some listening perhaps who can sympathize with that. Perhaps you're the older sibling and the younger sibling got married before you. Or maybe you're the younger sibling and you got married before the older sibling and your older sibling resents you for it. I don't know. I know that has happened. I've had some friends who were in that situation and got a little tense. So Laban says, it's not good for the younger to be married before the older, so I gave you Leah. If you want to work for another 7 years for Rachel, I'll give you Rachel too. So Laban essentially gets 14 years of free service, and he gets to offload his 2 daughters that sounds kind of cruel, I suppose, but he essentially gets 14 years of free service, and all he has to do is, in payment, is give Jacob 2 wives. And so at the end of the 14 years, Jacob gets to marry Rachel, and it's very clear that he favors Rachel above any of his wives. In verse 30 of Genesis 29, it says, he went in also unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him yet 7 other years. So it's at this time that he has his 2 wives, and between the 2 wives he fathers 12 sons, which we'll talk about a little bit later. I need to also point out, I kind of passed over this because it kind of goes in between the first 2 points. It's at this point that God himself passes on the Abrahamic covenant. In verse 13, let's go a little bit before that. Verse 10, Jacob went out from Beersheba and went towards Haran. And he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night, because the sun was set. And he took up the stones of that place and put them for his pillows, and lay down in that place to sleep. Talk about real camper there, sleeping on the rocks. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it, and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed, and thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And behold, I am with thee, and will keep thee in all places whither thou goest, and I will bring thee again into this land, for I will not leave thee until I have done that which I have spoken to thee of. Okay, so at this point, God visits Jacob in a dream, confers the passing of the covenant onto Jacob from Isaac, who got it from Abraham. And so we have that continuation of the Abrahamic covenant, the idea that the nation of Israel would be a great nation, that it would spread over the face of the land, that it would be given the land, and that all the families of the earth would indeed be blessed through this nation. In addition to the 14 years, Jacob works an additional 6 years And through all that, again, I encourage you to read through it. Some more trickery takes place in which Laban changes what he pays Jacob 10 times in the span of 6 years. Now, I've been working where I've been working for 5 years now, and I can say with certainty that my wages have only ever increased, as is usual in most businesses. The longer you stay with someone, the more you tend to receive as recompense. But in this case, Laban was trying to short Jacob each time by offering him the lesser of whatever was being born. Jacob was essentially being paid in animals. But Laban, while trying to trick Jacob, found himself being tricked by Jacob, as Jacob was a master of the science of animal breeding, and so was able to actually come out with more than what Laban had intended. If I could make my dollars breed so that they could have little baby dollars, that would be pretty exciting. But Jacob here essentially controls his own wages by causing the animals that he was to receive to breed, and he understood. And this is one of the things that I love about the Bible. You can see scientific principles being shown, where Jacob understands the idea of genetic traits being passed from parent to offspring. And so when Laban says you can have all of the ones with blemishes, well, Jacob causes all the ones with blemishes to breed more than the ones without blemishes, and so he gets more livestock. And then when Laban sees this, he tries to change the wages again, and so Jacob, just simply changes his tactics and is still able to receive more. And that's one of the things about the Bible that we need to understand, that the Bible itself is not a science textbook, but where it does speak scientifically, it is true. And so I encourage you to read through those sections. But in chapter 33, or chapter 32 is where he leaves. We're going to revisit chapter 32 in a moment. Chapter 33, he meets up with Esau after many years of being apart, and the two of them are reconciled. At this point, Esau himself is starting a rather large family. He has many people under his banner, so to speak, and so the two of them are reconciled, and more or less would be reconciled throughout most of Israel's history. There would be times where Esau, or as it's later known in the Bible, the nation of Edom, because of the stew that Jacob had sold to Esau, and it's actually back earlier. The nation of Edom and the nation of Israel would never, to my knowledge, go into full-on conflict. They would have their differences. They would have their issues between each other. For example, as the Israelites were coming out of the land of Egypt, the Edomites would not let them pass through the land. But they would never be, as far as I can recall throughout history, they would not go into full-blown war with Israel, although they would not follow Jehovah God and would be cursed for it later in Isaiah. Chapter 32, Jacob wrestles with God before meeting up with Esau, and this is where his name is changed to Israel. Essentially, Jacob meets a man who ends up being God, and the two of them wrestle until daylight. So God displaces Jacob's hip and calls him Israel, which is Prince of God at this point. So Jacob goes from being a trickster, a usurper, to being the Prince of God. That is what Israel means. All right, we'll return to Jacob in a little bit, but let's focus on the wives and sons. Remember, Leah here is the one who is not favored by Jacob. She is the less favorite wife. She is his first wife. She's not his favorite wife. But she is favored of God. Let's see here if I can find it again. Verse 31 of chapter 29. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened up her womb, but Rachel was barren. So God knows that Leah got a raw deal here, and so he chooses to bless Leah with children. I've said this before, in this day and age, it was very, very important for a woman to be able to have children. In fact, in some culture of the world today, it still is very important to a woman to be able to have children. In some cultures, we're starting to see women who we're starting to see the idea that it doesn't matter if a woman is able to have children or not, and certainly that is not where a woman's identity is. Her identity is in the Lord Jesus Christ. But in a lot of cultures, even still today, if a woman is not able to have children, that is considered a bad thing. So God chooses here to bless Leah, even though she is the unfavored one. And so she is able to have 6 sons, and she does have a daughter. Those sons would be Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. And then the one daughter, the only daughter that is recorded for Jacob, is Dinah. Now, I've said this before, Jacob has 12 sons. I don't know if there's anyone listening to me now who is a singleton daughter of many, many sons. I know my fiance, she's the only daughter and in a household with 5 brothers. So I can only imagine what life was like for Dinah, being the only girl in a family of 13. But we'll visit her again. She does have some small part to play in this story. Notice some of the names though. Reuben, Simeon, especially Levi and Judah. Levi and Judah are going to play very important roles in the nation of Israel. And they are the sons of Leah. And I find that interesting. Levi and Judah themselves are not exactly savory characters. A lot of these sons had many rough edges that needed to be taken care of before God could move on to the next stage. Rachel has 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. She has Joseph first, and then Benjamin comes a long ways away later. And unfortunately, she dies giving birth to Benjamin. And these are the 2 favorite sons of Jacob, or Israel, as I suppose I should now call them. They are the 2 favorite sons. In between having these children, the 2 women start to have fights about being able to bear children. Rachel, remember, is barren. So when Leah starts having sons, Rachel pulls Sarah and essentially gives her servant as a concubine to Jacob, in a manner similar to how Hagar was given to Abraham to bear sons. From these maidservants, you have the remaining 4 sons, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, who are born from the 2 concubines. So in total, you have 12 sons and 1 daughter. I guess Dinah never was in a household with all 12 sons, now that I think about it, because Joseph was sold into slavery before Benjamin was born, if I recall. So she was never in a household with all 12. Alright, so with Jacob's sons then, and we got to move a little bit quickly, Simeon Levi, this is where Dinah does play a small part in the story. In Genesis chapter 34, Dinah catches the eye of a local ruler's son, who then takes her and defiles her. And so in revenge for this, Simeon and Levi, through some trickery, slay an entire town in vengeance for the defiling of their daughter. I'm sorry?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I thought you had said something. Sister, yeah. Yes, excuse me. Thank you. For their sister, not their daughter. For their sister. So their sister is defiled, and so they go and basically convince the entire town's male population to be circumcised, which is a little unusual given the fact that the circumcision, if you recall, was a sign of was a token for the Abrahamic covenant. It was to be the sign that would separate them apart. But they essentially convince the town people that they'll let Dinah marry the ruler's son, and in addition they'll intermarry with the people if they also partake in circumcision. But in the end, the surgical procedure was just such to incapacitate all the men, so they were easier for these 2 brothers to go in and kill the entire town. And certainly this was not something that God approved of, or Israel, as basically Jacob says, "You've made us odious in the sight of the people. You've caused me to," verse 30, you have troubled me to make me stink amongst the inhabitants of the land. I being few in number, they shall gather themselves against me and slay me, and I shall be destroyed in my house. Jacob here doesn't really seem to care all that much about anyone other than himself in this particular section of the story. Simeon and Levi try to defend themselves. They say, "Should he deal with our sister as with an harlot?" And that's their justification for doing so, but certainly that is not that would not have been a part of God's plan later on, certainly not for the entire town to be slaughtered. And so that is kind of that's a stain on Simeon Levi. But again, this is where we could see God's grace and mercy coming into play, because Levi, the sons of Levi, are going to be the ones who take care of God's tabernacle and eventually God's temple. So in spite of this, God does choose to bless the family line of Levi specifically. Then you have Judah, from whom the line of Jesus Christ would come. Judah is tricked by his own daughter-in-law. The story of Judah's family is a little interesting. Basically, Judah's son has a wife. The son dies before the wife can have a daughter. And if you've read through the book of Ruth, you know that when when the son dies not having a daughter, then the nearest relative is supposed to take the woman on to be his wife and to have children in the name of the son who died. And that was part of the culture here, and certainly something that will carry on for many hundreds of years later. But all of the other sons refused to have children through this woman. And so the daughter-in-law takes it into her own hands to trick Judah into giving her children by disguising herself and having twins through Judah. At which point Judah at first is upset. He thinks that what this daughter has done was with another man, and then through some of her own deceit and trickery, she was able to prove, no, it was you who did this. And so Judah basically says she was more righteous than I am, and so he ends up having twins from his own daughter-in-law. Again, definitely not something desirable, and certainly not something that was a part of God's plan, but Judah, again, would still be blessed in spite of his wrongdoings, in spite of his flaws. And eventually Judah would be the one through whom the kings of Israel would come, and then also through which the Messiah would come. I've already mentioned Jacob favors Benjamin and Joseph as his two favorite sons, certainly Joseph first, and that becomes important with the story of Joseph. Now I have about 10 minutes to get through the story of Joseph, so I encourage you to take time to read it on your own. We're just going to hit the highlights of his life. Certainly there's a lot here that we could talk about, but it is a very familiar story to most of us, probably even to most who are listening on YouTube right now. The story of Joseph is probably one that is very familiar. Ideas of the life of Joseph show up in other stories as well, in secular stories. And so just to go through it, this basically goes from Genesis 37 to Genesis 50. And just to hit some of the main highlights, at the beginning, Joseph is given a coat of many colors by his father as being the favorite son. He is also the one to whom Jacob relies on for information about the other brothers. I find it fascinating here that Jacob's family is so big he can't keep tabs on them on his own. And what I find even more interesting is how in this culture, I mean, his sons are adults by this point. By the time we come around to Genesis 37, most of them have their own families by this point. But they are still underneath Jacob. They still owe their allegiance to Jacob. They have not separated from him. And so Joseph still keeps tabs on his brothers and gives report about what they're doing, most of the time bad. It's also during this time that Joseph has two dreams. One about sheaves of wheat bowing before his sheaf of wheat, his brother's sheaves of wheat bowing before him. The other is about the sun, moon, and stars bowing before his star, to which Jacob isn't very pleased either. He doesn't like the idea about bowing to his own son. And of course the brothers are not pleased either. Being an older brother, if my younger brother came to me and said, "You're going to have to bow down to me one day," I would laugh at him. In fact, he's in the military. I thought about becoming an officer in the military for the longest time just so he'd have to salute me. That thought did cross my mind. I thought that's a really shallow reason to go into the military. I can only imagine how that would look on a resume. So why'd you join the military? Just so I could get my brother to salute me. But nonetheless, no one is pleased about this development. Now, I don't know the spirit of Joseph. I've heard different preachers say different things. I've heard some say Joseph was not very kind about this. I've heard others say that Joseph was just doing his duty and that it was his brother's sinful hearts that caused them to hate him. I don't know. The Bible doesn't give us a whole lot in the way of attitudes here. Perhaps Joseph was naive for broadcasting out that his dreams were about his family bowing down to him when he already knew that his family didn't care for him all that much, or at least his brothers didn't. I don't know. But nonetheless, this angers them to the point that the next time he's sent out to get a report, they decide they're going to kill him. And so in continuing on in Genesis 37, they see Joseph and they decide they're going to kill him. They said, "Behold, this dreamer cometh. Come now, let us slay him and cast him into some pit. And we will say that an evil beast has devoured him, and let us see what will become of his dreams." So his brothers decide, you know what, let's just kill him, and his dreams won't come true. Reuben, though, Reuben actually does something good here. Now, we didn't talk about earlier, Reuben had taken his father's concubines for himself. He himself is not in very high standing with his family at this point. But he says, no, let's not kill him, let's just throw him into the pit. The idea is, as it says in the scripture, he's going to come back and free Joseph later. So Reuben takes pity on Joseph and tries to keep him alive. But then he has to leave, so after they throw Joseph into the pit, along comes Judah and says, hey, why don't we just sell him? He looks up, he sees a caravan of Ishmaelites coming through, Midianites, and says, well, why don't we just sell him into slavery? Let's make some profit off of him. How could we bow to him when he's in some far-off land serving as a slave? And so the other brothers think that making a profit off of Joseph is a good idea. So they sell him into slavery. Reuben comes back, figures out what happens. In order to cover the story up, they take the coat of many colors, they tear it up, dip it in blood, make it look like Joseph was mauled by a lion or some other beast. Jacob, it does say Jacob has daughters, all his sons and his daughters. I wonder if there were some that were not mentioned. Interesting. He mourns for Joseph, and Joseph is sold into slavery. I forgot to put these up there. Reuben wanted him free, Judah wanted to sell him, and so they end up selling him into slavery. And so they wanted to kill him, but they decided, you know what, let's make a profit off of him. And so they put him into slavery. So now he ends up in Egypt in the house of Potiphar, who is the captain of the guard. So we're in Genesis 39 now. Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, bought him off the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper at his hand. Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had put into his hand. And that's an important lesson that we can learn here. We've been mostly focusing on just the surface level, getting through the stories, but I want to take a moment for some personal application here. Joseph is not in the most ideal of situations. His family hated him. His brothers threatened to kill him and then sold him into slavery, and he's now in the land of Egypt. Okay, they did not serve God. They had their own set of gods, and certainly we could go into the historical, the histories of the Egyptian religions. Even they didn't really know who they served. They went through like 3 different religions in their history. Not a single one of them serving Jehovah God. So here he is in a land of people who do not believe in Jehovah God, probably people who, there may have been some people who still remember what Abraham had done the first time in causing plagues to come on Egypt for lying. But here he is in a foreign land, sold into slavery. He could have just essentially cursed God and died for what was happening to him. But instead, he decides that he's going to make as good of an impression as he possibly can. God is with him. God blesses him in his efforts. And Potiphar sees this and so allows Joseph to rise through the ranks of being a slave until he's overseer of the house. Basically, he's in control of the money and the goods that would flow through Potiphar's house. It was not unusual for wealthy for wealthy nobility during this time to have a servant or a slave who would take care of these things. Even Abraham had, I believe it was Eliezer, to take care of his goods for him. And so God prospers Joseph here. Unfortunately, this catches the eye of Potiphar's wife, who decides, I guess, she's bored with Potiphar, and so she tries to seduce Joseph. Again, something not uncommon. If you read through Egyptian, Greek, and Roman histories, it was not uncommon for people to use slaves as just kind of toys, playthings for themselves. Certainly not right. Certainly God would not approve. But this is not, it would not have been unusual, I guess, for Potiphar's wife to do this, is what I'm trying to say. This was a pretty common practice throughout the ancient world for masters to just kind of treat their slaves as playthings. So she tries to do the same thing. Joseph resists, causing her to become angry, and so she falsely accuses Joseph of attempting to defile her, and so Joseph is tossed into prison. One thing I'd like to point out here is some people have pointed out that he is tossed into the prison where the nobility was kept, or at least the noble slaves were kept. He was not tossed into the common prisons where slaves were often executed for their crimes. He was tossed into a prison where other noble slaves were kept. He talks about the butcher and the baker. And so perhaps some commentators have suggested that Potiphar believed Joseph and did not believe his wife, but in order to save face, had to throw Joseph out. I don't know. I've heard it the other way too. Potiphar did believe his wife. Either way, Joseph is cast into prison. He's not executed, which was a little unusual for Egypt. Egypt was known for executing their slaves on a whim, but he is cast into prison where he again becomes well favored, and it's there that he interprets two dreams of the butcher, or not the butcher, the baker and the cupbearer, the butler. That's why I kept saying butcher, butler and butcher. The butler and the baker, excuse me, and interpreting that one of them would be released and the other one would be executed. To the one who is released, he basically says, hey, remember me when you get out of prison, and that individual forgets up until Pharaoh himself has a few dreams that trouble him. So he is reminded, or he is told about Joseph. Joseph is then brought out of the prison where he tells Pharaoh that there will be 7 good years followed by 7 famine years in the land, and that he needs to prepare for those 7 years of famine. And this is backed up by history. There was a famine that took place during this time. There were plenty of famines that took place during this time, and so this is backed up historically that there was a famine during this time. And so Joseph is told by Pharaoh to is elevated by Pharaoh to a position of power, and to second in command, because Pharaoh could see that God was with Joseph, and so Pharaoh wanted Joseph to take charge of preparing Egypt for famine. As we wrap up, during the famine, Joseph's brothers come down to Egypt, similar to Abraham coming to Egypt during time of famine. The nice thing about Egypt is that it's got the Nile River, so even if there's no rain, they can still grow food. But even the Egyptians were having trouble growing food, but because of Joseph's foresight, they had stored up a lot of food and were able to sell the food to others. So Joseph's brothers come. Again, I encourage you to read through this. We are out of time. But essentially, he does not reveal himself the first time, but the second time he does reveal himself. And so he tests them through Benjamin. He hears about Benjamin. He tests them to see, have my brothers changed? And when his brothers basically plead for Benjamin's life by essentially putting themselves into Benjamin's place, that's proof enough for Joseph that they have changed. And so he reveals himself and has the entire family brought to Egypt, where eventually Jacob would die and then be buried in Canaan. And so the brothers are now in Egypt, and this sets the stage for the beginning of the book of Exodus, which I'm sure at some point we'll have a class on. But I encourage you to read through Genesis 37 through 50 on your own. See some of those applications that we've made for yourself. This ends our series of Genesis. we'll see what classes come next, but I hope that the series has been profitable to you. It has certainly been profitable to me, and hope these videos can be a blessing.